Last things first, the comparison between the Vietnam War and the United States in its still ongoing endeavor to conquer and occupy Afghanistan, the comparison between the two is flawed because the reality of what happened in Vietnam is that the United States won militarily but was completely defeated politically. Whereas in Afghanistan, the United States has won politically but has been defeated militarily. The context for this video is that in just the last few days, the Western press has been jumping all over, quote unquote, the Afghanistan papers. And even the naming of these papers, the naming of them as such, is an intentional allusion to, a comparison to, the Pentagon papers that came out during the Vietnam War. And it is somewhat bizarre that the main complaint being made by the Western media is that the public, the general public in America, were lied to about what had been happening in Afghanistan. I think most of my viewers will agree with me. I'm not saying everyone, but just the type of people who watch my channel for politics. For me, there were absolutely no surprises in the Afghanistan papers. I was like, wait a minute. You people feel you've been lied to? This is exactly what I've been reading in the last 10 years and more. This is all very familiar to me. This is what I was, again, maybe we haven't been reading the same news sources or something, but the type of reflections, the types of meditations on the U.S. military's lack of success in Afghanistan, none of this was shocking or new to me. None of it was really even a contrast to the type of reporting and analysis I've become accustomed to on Afghanistan. I have a very strong memory now. When the United States was 10 years into the war in Afghanistan, there was a report where the journalist was standing next to the most senior general, the highest ranking commander on the American side in Afghanistan, and they had a big map rolled out on the table, and the general was explaining how 10 years into the combat, 10 years, they were fighting to try to secure basic supply lines, basic roads for trade and transport in and out of the capital city in Afghanistan. And he was explaining how, if they can just achieve this in the next few months or next few years, then it will be possible for farmers in Afghanistan to stop farming opium and instead start farming other crops. Because the thing is about opium is it doesn't require refrigeration. It doesn't require that you transport it rapidly. You can wait a long time to ship opium slowly. But he was saying once the Taliban is driven off these roads, then farming will flourish and democracy will flourish and everyone's going to support the American installed machine there. And I was just laughing and laughing. I was laughing out loud because this was being presented to the audience as like news of victory, like news that the war was going well. It's like, no. When you're 10 years into the war and you can't drive between the only two cities that the country has, Afghanistan doesn't have that many booming metropolises, when there only are about 3 highways in the whole country that you need to secure, and you haven't secured any of those 3 highways, guys, this is not victory. This is news of defeat. This is showing you the ongoing defeat, fully 10 years into the war with a $1 trillion budget. And I think the same thing could basically be said today. Of course, in some ways things have changed. But so to say, I don't feel I've been lied to. It may be that I'm reading a very different sort of news than the average person who's getting excited about the so-called, I was going to say Pentagon papers, the so-called Afghanistan papers. All right. So when we understand a conflict, the question of what we compare it to historically matters morally. It matters ethically. It matters in how we receive the news of the cost of war and how we rationalize the cost of war. So to give an example here, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. I think everyone watching this video who is older than 50 years old will immediately know what I talk about when I say the Tet Offensive. And everyone who is younger than 50, you either don't know or, that's something my grandfather mentioned once, right? The Tet Offensive was remembered as a victory for the Vietnamese side. That is a lie, quantitatively, qualitatively, in military terms, in tactical terms, in strategic terms. In all those palpable real-world ways, the American side won the Tet Offensive. They caused unbelievable casualties to the communist side, And the communist side didn't attain any of its sort of checklist of objectives, what it was they were trying to actually, the targets they were trying to actually conquer. However, the Vietnamese side won a political victory. The photographs of the sorrow and suffering and death and carnage, and even the poverty that came back to the United States of America from the Tet Offensive, the American public couldn't rationalize them. They couldn't justify them in their own minds. Morally, it was seen as disgraceful what America had done in the Tet Offensive. So this is very important. The American side was discredited not by its military defeat, but by its military victory in the Tet Offensive. Okay? The Americans did not lose the actual combat. And if you just scale it up in round numbers with the American war in Vietnam, you're talking about over 1 million deaths on the communist side, the pro-communist side, over 1 million deaths. And when you get into the numbers, the problem is, are you just talking about combat deaths, or are you talking about civilian deaths and this kind of thing? But in any case, we're well over 1 million in the calculus on that side. And on the pro-American side, is it even 60,000 deaths? Again, you could have a footnote here within a long list of considerations for who gets counted in these deaths. Do you include people fighting over the border in Cambodia and Laos, and do you include tribal people in the highlands who signed up to fight for the French and then continued fighting against the communists and were never really on the American side? There are actually some really strange footnotes when you get into the details doing the math. But the point is here, in general, the number of deaths on the pro-communist side is unbelievably greater than the number of deaths within the American armed forces and even on the American allied side, right? So you can look at the Vietnam War in a sort of purely tactical sense as a victory for the American army. And yet, of course, this is one of the most important defeats for the United States of America in the entire history of the country. It was, a devastating, transformative defeat for the United States of America. They lost politically. Now, they could have seen this coming. The United States had a war in the Philippines that nobody likes to talk about anymore. That war started around 1899 or 1900, 1901. When the war starts, you can kind of pick a different point in the timeline. I remember it as 1899. When exactly the combat starts to escalate is kind of another question. But anyway, right about there, the United States fought a war in the Philippines, and the current conclusions from the American side are that the Americans killed more than 1 million people in the Philippines at that time, conquering the Philippines. Did the Americans win? Again, it's kind of a similar question. Can anyone possibly look back at the American war in the Philippines and think of it as a victory for the United States? In many important ways, it was a devastating, demoralizing loss for America. It was a moment when America had to look in the mirror and behold in its own reflection a type of ruthless imperialism, right? It very deeply shook the moral foundations of American democracy that admittedly were on a somewhat moral shaky basis anyway due to the history of genocide of indigenous people and slavery of African Americans and so on. But nevertheless, what they did in the Philippines raised new questions to be answered. And those questions could have been answered and should have been answered precisely to prevent the kind of horror story of what unfolded in the American war in Vietnam. But the lesson that was there to be learned in the war in the Philippines is you can kill 1 million people and either lose the war politically or, in a sense, win the war but have a completely Pyrrhic victory. Have a victory that you regret. Have a victory where you look back and think, wow, I wish we'd never fought that war at all. Another example like this, again, so this is, I'm going to jump ahead to war in Afghanistan in just a second. Another example is the American military conquest and occupation of Haiti. Does anyone remember that as a victory? I mean, it's a horrifying war. Yes, America did conquer Haiti. I mean, in terms of the number of casualties, completely asymmetrical, And then the United States ruled Haiti as a military dictatorship under the command of the U.S. Marine Corps. So this is imperialism in its purest form, military imperialism, when the United States conquered Haiti. All right. Now, again, and just to be clear, I know this sounds a bit surreal to say, it wasn't the case that Haiti had diamond mines or oil fields or some kind of natural resource for the Americans to plunder, right? There was no benefit to the United States of America as a democracy or as an empire or something. And obviously, anyone would look back at that war in Haiti and think, wow, this was a terrible thing for the United States of America. You could say it was a moral defeat, even though it was a military victory. So, again, there were lessons to be learned here already in the comparisons earlier than the Vietnam War to the Vietnam War. As I've said on this channel before, the Americans did not think about Vietnam this way. Instead, the comparisons that provided them with a moral framework or like a picture frame for how they were imagining their purpose there were their remarkable success in Japan and then their remarkable success in South Korea. You could even include here their success in West Germany. Now, what do these three have in common? 5 minutes after America conquered Japan, the Japanese public themselves produced a pro-American, pro-democracy government. It all just seemed to come together. Yes, I could now, again, I could have a footnote here, and we could digress into some of the details. The actual Constitution of Japan was written by members of the U.S. military staff. It's a somewhat strange story. But nevertheless, Japan had a kind of thriving pro-American democracy 5 minutes after America conquered the country. Oh, great. So this trained the American to think in these terms. All they had to do was conquer Vietnam, and then a pro-American, pro-democracy government would rise up and replace the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? So, sorry, I'm mixing up my examples here. You can imagine if the paradigm you're using for American history is their success in Japan or their success in West Germany, where again, seemingly overnight, the Nazis were replaced with a pro-democracy, pro-American government, they might think, oh, all that America has to do is conquer Vietnam, and then immediately there will be a pro-American, pro-democracy government take over Vietnam. All that America has to do is march across Afghanistan and then somehow liberate the people of Afghanistan to rise up in this. And that is, of course, a completely ridiculous framework to view that war, whether you're looking ahead, looking at the future of that war when it's ongoing, or now looking back at the past, the last 20 years roughly. Yeah. So I just say, comparisons of this kind, they really do matter. They're fateful, and they have a terrible binding ethical significance. Now, when Americans look back at the war in Haiti, when Americans look back at the war in the Philippines, and when Americans now look back at the war in Afghanistan, maybe the facile and easy conclusion would be to say the only way to win that war would be to not fight the war at all. Okay. Certainly a lot of people feel about the American war in Vietnam that the best way for the Americans to have won in Vietnam would be to not fight the war at all. Well, it is a little bit different, though, because as I've said, in Vietnam, the Americans won militarily and they lost politically. And that included losing the propaganda war. A large part of what people still know about the Vietnam War today was propaganda produced by the Vietnamese themselves, and then to some extent, propaganda produced by the Soviet Union and by China. But a lot of it was created by Vietnamese people themselves. This is not the case at all in Afghanistan. I don't think anyone in the Western world is influenced by pro-Taliban propaganda. It doesn't have this quality. Nobody in the press is reporting the Taliban version of events as having some kind of equal validity to the American or European version of events. And you have to keep in mind, during the Vietnam War, that really happened. So, there'd be negotiations, and the Americans and the French would be present, and then the Soviet Union and China and some representative of the communist side in Vietnam, they would show up and present what they had to say. And they made presentations to the Western press too, and so on. There really was a very successful, very compelling propaganda war coming from the Vietnamese side. And that also shaped and influenced and galvanized left-wing movements within the United States of America. It had really long-term consequences. And, some of that propaganda was sort of purely aesthetic, depicting the poverty of the Vietnamese and their physical smallness compared to these giant, well-fed Americans. So, the Vietnamese people being thin and short and poverty-stricken, and the Americans being fat and ruthless and terrible. How they depicted things like prostitution and rape and torture and so on being done by the Americans. There was this, very emotionally moving case for the victimization of Vietnam by the Americans that eroded moral support for what the Americans were doing. And of course, the Americans do indeed deserve a significant portion of the blame in this. To use just one example, Condor Island, also known as Con Dao Island, I think Condao, Con Dao Island. That was a torture facility that was used by the French Empire. And then when the Americans began their war in the area, they just took over the torture facility. They kept doing the same thing the French Empire had been doing in the same building. They used the same island, same torture facility. So the idea that the United States of America represented something morally superior to French imperialism before it is challenged by this. The French Empire operated a dope dealing operation, the opium trade in Vietnam that was specifically done by the French military intelligence in the final period of the French Empire there, which is up to and during World War II. In that final period of the French Empire, their intelligence agency was hustling opium. What did the CIA do? They took over this drug dealing operation. So, there were many obvious ways in which the United States utterly failed to represent some sort of higher moral standard. And the United States found itself defending the use of torture, for example. I still see this to this day. I see this in new books, in new writing about the American War in Vietnam. People will point out that the Americans used torture in Vietnam. And Americans will say back, well, do you think the communist side was using torture also? Like, do you really think we were worse than the communists? And they'll give some examples of the communists torturing people. This is just as ridiculous as trying to kind of argue on the basis of moral equality with the Taliban. It's like, well, the Taliban, they murder and torture people too. Okay, if you don't represent a dramatically higher standard of ethical conduct than, the Vietnamese communists or the Taliban, then this conversation we're having it's not worth having. So, all right, my leitmotif and my conclusion for this video is this. In Afghanistan, the Americans didn't lose politically. The Americans succeeded politically, not just in the propaganda war, but in terms of political reality in the capital city, in all two major cities in Afghanistan. They succeeded in creating elections, in creating a democracy, in creating a free press, in creating newspapers and radio and TV. They created this kind of infrastructure for democracy, and they created, at enormous expense to the American taxpayer, they created a system of education and hospitals and elections and all the components for a very fragile democracy in Afghanistan. And politically, nobody in the Western world, nobody sympathizes with the Taliban instead of this fragile democracy. So politically, what they did in Afghanistan was in many ways a success. And, they only had a few cards in their deck to play, but they played the women's access to education card, and they played the democracy card, and they played these things pretty well. So, again, this is really the opposite of Vietnam, where the United States really couldn't claim to represent some kind of legitimate democracy in their occupied area of Vietnam and so on and so forth. Anyway, long story there. So politically, both in terms of the reality of politics and in terms of the propaganda war, America won in Afghanistan. But simply put, in Afghanistan, America had military failure. It's a military, tactical, strategic failure. They never won in terms of actually occupying the country or even making the few roads in and out of the capital city safe for trade. Is there any truth to the claim that the American public were lied to prior to the release of this report, the so-called Afghanistan Papers? As I mentioned, I don't feel that way. I don't think most of my viewers will feel that way. I think it's been blatantly obvious to anyone who took even a kind of passing interest in what was happening in the Afghan conflict that America was losing. Again, militarily, that they were losing the war, and that there never was a declaration of victory, so to speak. What's interesting is that the Afghanistan Papers reveal the internal analysis of why they were losing. And it shows that many people in the American military had some quite good ideas of what was wrong with the American effort and why they were losing. So one of the leading major generals, I'm sorry if I'm getting his rank wrong, but one of the most senior commanders interviewed, he puts great emphasis on the fact that in Congress and in the Senate in the United States, almost nobody can read, write, or speak any Afghan language. That within the military, in terms of Americans who had learned the languages of Afghanistan, even though they're more than 10 years into this war, they had a small handful, he said, a small handful of people with language abilities. And of course, this language ability is very fundamental to all the other kinds of meaningful intelligence and understanding. So it doesn't show you what an external intellectual snob like me thinks was wrong with the American war in Afghanistan. It shows what commanders and generals, the men who fought the war within the American side, what they thought was wrong with the effort in Afghanistan. And in large part, they were right. They were fighting a cause that was doomed to fail. They were using the wrong tactics, the wrong methods. They had some of the wrong motivations. They had people who lacked the crucial skills, most obviously and palpably who lacked the language ability, that they lacked an understanding of the political situation, the culture, so on and so forth. And the army knew it. So again, what we have here really is a kind of political failure, because evidently in the House of Congress, in the Senate, and in the White House, they were incapable of responding to the news of that failure that was given to them in these same reports, the so-called Afghanistan papers. They were handed this intelligence. Hey, this is why, point one, you're losing the war. Point two, this is why you're losing the war. Point three, here's what you can do about it. And they never did take the steps to improve what they were doing. And so still today, we're stuck with this tragic outcome.